The first story comes from a heavily forested region in the Pacific Northwest, a place that already has a reputation, if you know where to look for it. The forests of Washington and Oregon are not like the forests in storybooks. They are ancient in a way that feels almost aggressive. The trees, Douglas firs, Sitka spruces, western red cedars, grow so tall and so dense that the canopy above you becomes its own kind of ceiling, its own enclosed world, and the floor beneath them is soft and dark and layered with 100 years of fallen things. If you stand still long enough in one of those forests, you stop feeling like a visitor. You start feeling like an intrusion. In the fall of a year not long ago, a man named Dorian Haas rented a cabin in a stretch of wilderness about 40 minutes east of a small town that most people have never heard of and would struggle to find on a map. Dorian was 34 years old, an architect by trade, and according to everyone who knew him, he was one of those people who seemed to have everything approximately together. Stable job, good friends, a long-term relationship that had recently ended, not dramatically, just quietly, the way some things end, and a genuine healthy-seeming desire to spend a week alone in the woods to reset. He'd rented through a private listing, the kind you find on those platforms where individuals rent out their second properties or inherited land. The cabin was described as rustic but comfortable, with running water, a wood stove, a covered porch, and no Wi-Fi. That last detail was a selling point, not a warning. He paid for 7 nights and drove out on a Saturday in mid-October, when the leaves in that part of the country go the color of old fire and the air carries the first real bite of cold. The cabin was exactly what the listing had promised. Small, one main room with a sleeping loft accessible by a wooden ladder, a kitchen area against the back wall, a bathroom that was functional if modest, and a front porch that faced a clearing before the tree lean began. Dorian unloaded his car, stacked firewood on the porch, made himself a simple dinner on the propane stove, and sat outside until the sky went fully dark, which out there happens fast and happens completely. He described that first evening in the notes he kept on his phone, a habit he'd had for years, as one of the most peaceful he could remember in a long time. The silence was extraordinary. Not the silence of a quiet room in a city, where you can still hear the building breathe, still feel the low hum of electrical current in the walls. This was a different silence. Full, deep, like the world had been turned down to zero. He slept well. He woke the next morning to fog in the clearing and a woodpecker working somewhere in the trees, and he made coffee and sat on the porch and felt, by his own account, genuinely grateful. The first strange thing happened on the third day. He'd been on a long hike that afternoon, several hours out on a trail that curved through the forest and eventually looped back near the cabin. It was on the return leg that he noticed, through a gap in the trees, a structure he hadn't seen before. It was at a distance, maybe 200 meters off the trail, visible only because of the angle of the late afternoon light hitting it a certain way. A building, low and dark. He assumed it was another cabin, maybe a hunting blind or an old storage structure belonging to a neighboring property. He made a mental note of it, but didn't investigate. He was tired. The light was fading. That night, he heard something on the porch. He was in the sleeping loft, had been asleep for maybe 2 hours, when the sound woke him. It was a slow, deliberate creaking of the wooden boards, the kind that has weight behind it, the kind that would make when something is standing on it. He lay still, listening. It continued for a few seconds, then stopped. He told himself it was an animal, a raccoon, a deer, something that had wandered up curious about the smell of food. He didn't go down to look. He told himself later that he should have. In the morning, there was nothing on the porch. No tracks in the soft ground at the edge of the steps, which was strange, because if it had been a large animal, you'd expect some mark in the mud. But the ground was undisturbed, and the 3 pieces of firewood he had stacked neatly against the porch railing the evening before had been moved, rearranged. Not knocked over, not scattered, placed in a different configuration. 2 of them were now positioned leaning against each other in a kind of arch. The third was flat on the decking in front of them, like a threshold. Dorian stood looking at this for a long time. He took a photo. You can actually see the photo, because he shared it later. It doesn't look like much, 3 pieces of firewood in an unusual arrangement on a wooden porch. But when he describes the feeling he had looking at it that morning, he uses a specific phrase. He says it looked intentional. Not accidental, not random, intentional. Like something had arranged it to communicate something, and the frustrating, terrifying part was that he had no idea what. He considered leaving. He genuinely considered packing up the car and driving back to the city. But it was morning, and the sun was out, and in daylight things rearranged themselves in your head. He convinced himself he'd somehow done it himself. Sleepwalking, maybe, though he had no history of that. Or maybe the firewood had just shifted. Gravity. Wood settling. He rearranged the pieces back into a normal stack, made himself breakfast, and went for another walk. The structure he'd seen through the trees the previous afternoon was gone. Not gone in the sense that he couldn't find it. Gone in the sense that when he went to the spot where he'd seen it, walked the extra 200 meters off the trail through wet undergrowth, there was nothing there. No building. No foundation. No sign of one. Just trees, and the particular deep shadow that collects under old growth, and the feeling, immediate and physical, like a hand on the back of the neck, that he should not be standing in that spot. He went back to the trail. He walked back to the cabin. He spent the rest of that day inside, reading, not looking out the windows more than he could help. That night, the sound came back. But it wasn't on the porch this time. It was in the tree line. He was awake when it started. He hadn't been able to fall asleep, which he would note later was unusual for him, and lying in the loft in the dark, staring at the ceiling, he heard it begin. It was a sound like someone moving through dry leaves at the edge of the forest. A slow, deliberate sound. It moved from one side of the clearing to the other. He could track it by ear, the crunch shifting from left to right over the course of maybe 4 minutes. Then it stopped. Then it started again. From the left. Moving right. Again. This happened 3 times. Same pace. Same path. Same stop at the right edge of the clearing. And then after the 3rd pass, complete silence. He did not sleep that night. In the morning, he walked to the tree line at the edge of the clearing. The ground there was soft and covered in a layer of recently fallen leaves. He was looking for tracks, for any sign of what had been walking there. And he found something, not tracks exactly, but a line. A long, smooth compression in the leaves and the soft earth, as if something had been dragged across the ground. Not an animal. Animals don't move in perfectly straight lines. This was straight. Deliberate. 2 separate straight lines, each about 30 feet long parallel, running left to right at the edge of the clearing exactly where the sound had been. He called the property owner that day. Got voicemail. Left a message that he tried to keep calm and factual. He never received a call back. He stayed 2 more days. Not because he wasn't afraid, he was. But because he became, as he described it, fascinated. Something about the experience had crossed a line in him from fear into something he couldn't quite name. He set up his phone on a tripod on the porch, pointed at the clearing, with a time-lapse recording running overnight. The footage from that recording is the part of this story that people discuss most in the forums where it circulates. The footage shows the clearing in near total darkness. The camera was not infrared, so what you're seeing is the ambient light from a quarter moon and stars. For the first several hours, nothing. Then, at approximately 3:17 in the morning, the footage shows something at the edge of the tree line. It is not clear. It is not dramatic. It is a shape, vertical, upright, roughly human in proportion, standing absolutely still at the far left edge of the frame. It is there for 11 minutes. Then it is not there. The footage does not show it moving. It is simply there, and then it isn't. Dorian left the next morning. He packed his car in the gray pre-dawn light, moving quickly, not looking toward the tree line. He described the drive back to the city as one of the longest of his life, not because of distance, but because of the certainty he could not shake that something in those woods was aware that he was leaving and was watching him go. He never rented that cabin again. He's tried to find the listing several times since and reports that it no longer appears on the platform. The property owner's contact information, when he's tried to look it up, returns no results. He still doesn't know what he saw. He still doesn't know what left those lines in the soft earth at the edge of his clearing. And if you ask him, and people have asked him many times, he will tell you that the not knowing is the part that never went away. Think about that for a moment. Think about what it would feel like to see footage of something standing outside the place you're sleeping and not be able to explain it. Not to have a single reasonable, comforting explanation available to you. We're built for explanations. Our brains are extraordinarily good at generating them, even when they don't fit perfectly. We'll reach for the most comforting story available and hold on to it. But what happens when there isn't one? What happens when you've exhausted every rational possibility and you're still left with the image of a vertical shape standing at the edge of the trees at 3 in the morning, watching? Let's go to the second cabin. This story comes from a different part of the country entirely. The Appalachian Mountains of western North Carolina, in a stretch of highland wilderness that sits between two small towns and is bisected by a river that runs cold and fast year-round. The mountains here are old. Some of the oldest exposed rock on the surface of North America. And the forests that cover them have that old mountain quality, gnarled, dense, full of sounds that carry in strange ways because of the ridges and hollows. A sound from a mile away can reach you in those hollows with perfect clarity. A sound from 20 feet away can disappear entirely. The cabin in this story was not a rental. It had been in the family of a woman named Lorette Vance for 3 generations, built by her grandfather in the early part of the last century, maintained and used by the family for decades as a summer retreat. Lorette was 51, a high school art teacher, divorced, the mother of 2 adult children who had both moved to different cities. She had been going to the cabin every summer since childhood and had, over the years, established a relationship with the place that was deep and comfortable and full of specific memories. The smell of the particular wood her grandfather had used for the interior walls, the way the river sounded at different times of day, the path through the forest she'd been walking since she was 8 years old. She went up in late July of the year this story takes place. Alone, which was not unusual. She'd spent several weeks alone at the cabin over the years. She brought supplies for 2 weeks, her sketchbooks, her paints, a stack of novels, and the deliberate intention to do nothing but rest and make work and be in a place she loved. For the first week, everything was exactly as it had always been. She hiked. She sketched the view from the ridge above the cabin. She swam in the river in the mornings. She sat on the back porch in the evenings with a glass of wine and watched the light change in the trees and felt the particular quality of peace that she associated with that place above all others. On the 8th day, she found the marks on the door. The cabin's front door was original. Solid wood, painted red, with the paint worn and layered in the way of very old paint, the kind that's been applied over decades over earlier coats and carries that history in its texture. She'd looked at that door 10,000 times. She knew every groove, every place where the paint had chipped or blistered or been scratched by a tree branch during a storm. The marks were new. They were scratched into the lower half of the door, at a height of about 2.5 feet from the ground. So, low. Lower than a person standing would naturally reach to scratch something. They were deep enough to have gone through to bare wood in places, and they formed a pattern that she struggled to describe at first. She photographed them extensively. The closest thing she could compare them to, she eventually said, was a series of overlapping vertical lines, like tally marks, but irregular, grouped in a way that suggested organization without being immediately readable as any symbol she recognized. The marks had not been there the previous evening. She was certain of this because she had painted on the porch that afternoon and had been back and forth through the front door a dozen times before dark. The marks were made in the night. She examined them carefully. They were not animal scratches. She knew what those looked like, had seen them on trees and posts around the property before. Animal scratches are irregular, follow the motion of a limb or paw, have a characteristic arc. These were vertical. Controlled, made by something that was moving downward, repeatedly, with consistent pressure. She called her daughter, who told her to come home. She called a friend, who also told her to come home. She decided to stay. This decision is the part of the story that people find most difficult to understand, and yet when you listen to Lorette talk about it, it makes a strange kind of sense. This was her family's place. Her grandfather had built it. Her mother had been a child there. She had been a child there. Something about leaving felt like a surrender of something too important to surrender. So she stayed. And she started paying attention in a different way. She began keeping an extremely detailed journal, not just of events, but of impressions. Of the quality of sound around the cabin at different times of day and night. Of anything she noticed that felt out of place or different from her established experience of the place. She was systematic about it. Schoolteachers' habits. What she documented over the next 6 days is quietly extraordinary. First, the birds. She noted that the birds around the cabin, the various species she'd been familiar with for decades, the wood thrushes and the juncos and the warblers that moved through the hollows, were behaving differently. Not absent, but different. They were not singing from the trees near the cabin the way they normally did. They were singing from further away, from the higher ridgeline, and in the early mornings when she came out to the porch, the trees immediately around the cabin were quiet in a way she found she couldn't account for. Second, the path. The path she'd been walking for over 40 years, the one that curved down to the river, passed through a particular section of forest about 5 minutes' walk from the cabin where the trees were older and the canopy was lower and the light was different. She'd always found this section beautiful. On the 9th day, walking through it, she felt, immediately and completely and without any visible cause, that she needed to stop. Not that she wanted to stop, not that some rational part of her had decided to stop. Some part of her below the level of conscious thought simply stopped walking and refused to continue. She stood on the path for what she described as a full minute, listening, feeling. Nothing happened. Nothing appeared. But the feeling did not leave until she turned around and walked back toward the cabin. She did not go to the river that day. Third, on the 11th night, she heard singing. This is the part of Lorette's account that is most often cited, most often discussed, most often questioned. She describes waking at roughly 2 in the morning to a sound she initially believed was her own dream bleeding into waking. It was a voice, or something that functioned like a voice, coming from outside the cabin in the direction of the forest behind the structure. She describes it not as melodic in any conventional sense, not a tune she could identify, but as rhythmic, syllabic, and deeply monotonous. The same sounds, repeated in the same order, at the same pace. Over and over. She lay listening to it for a long time before she was certain she was awake. When certainty arrived, she did not get up. She did not look out the window. She pulled the covers up and stayed still until the sound stopped, which took approximately 40 minutes by her phone's clock. In the morning, she walked to the area behind the cabin where the sound had seemed to come from. The ground there sloped upward toward the ridge, covered in ferns and mountain laurel and the occasional large gray rock. At the base of one of the rocks, she found the marks again. The same kind of marks as on the door, vertical, controlled, grouped, but here made in the soft soil, as if pressed in with something pointed. They were arranged in a circle, or close to it. A rough circle about 6 feet in diameter around the base of the rock. She took photographs. She left the following morning. The marks she photographed, both on the door and in the soil, have been shared online and examined by various people with various levels of claimed expertise. No one has been able to say definitively what made them. They don't match any known animal marking pattern. They don't match any known conventional symbol system. One researcher who focuses on Appalachian folklore noted that marks described as circles around specific stones or trees appear in accounts of old mountain practices, some attributed to isolated communities that existed in those mountains before and during the early colonial period. But to be careful here, that is speculation. A theory. There is no proven connection between those historical accounts and what Lorette found at her family's cabin. What is not a theory is that Lorette Vance, who had been going to that cabin her entire life and who had never once felt afraid there, has not been back. The cabin still belongs to her family. It sits up in those mountains right now, at the end of the road that turns off about 2 miles past the river bridge, the red door facing the trees. She doesn't know what was out there. She suspects, and this is her own theory, offered quietly, without any real certainty, that whatever it was had always been there. That the property, the hollow, the specific location in those old mountains, had always had something present in it. And that for some reason, after decades of coexistence, that something had decided to make itself known. Why then? Why that summer? She doesn't know. Maybe, she says, it had nothing to do with her at all. Maybe she just happened to be there when something changed. When something, after long years of quiet, decided it was tired of being ignored. Now, let's take a breath before the third story, because what's coming is different in a specific way. The first 2 stories deal with presences, with things outside, at the edge. The third story deals with something closer, something that got inside before anyone noticed. And that distinction, outside versus inside, the threshold between the two, is worth thinking about. There's a reason the threshold of a doorway has been culturally significant across virtually every human civilization in recorded history. In ancient Rome, Janus was the god of doorways, of beginnings and endings, of the passage between states. In countless folk traditions across cultures, the doorway is understood as a liminal space, a boundary. Something that must be properly observed, properly respected. Not everyone who studies folklore would put it this way, but many would tell you that in the old understanding of the world, the door of your home was the line between what was yours and what was not. And that line mattered enormously. What happens when that line gets crossed? What happens when you're inside and so is something else? The third cabin is in Minnesota. Northern Minnesota, in the lake country above Duluth, where the landscape shifts from the rolling forested hills of the south to something flatter and more exposed, where the lakes are very large and very cold, and the sky in winter comes down to meet the land with an intimacy that feels almost threatening. In summer, this region is extraordinarily beautiful and attracts a significant number of visitors. In late autumn and early spring, it is not for the faint-hearted. The story involves 4 people. A group of old college friends who tried to maintain an annual trip together despite the scatter of adult life across different cities. A man named Theron Calloway, his wife Mina, and their friends Casper Drell and Ren Okafor Singh. They'd been doing some version of an annual trip for 9 years. Sometimes it was a city trip. Sometimes camping. This year, Casper had found a large cabin rental on one of the lakes north of Grand Marais, advertised as comfortably sleeping 8 people, fully equipped, with a private dock. They booked it for 5 nights in early November, which in that part of Minnesota means temperatures near or below freezing overnight, the possibility of early snow, and an end-of-season quiet that descends on tourist areas like a lid closing on a box. They arrived on a Friday afternoon and found the cabin more than adequate, a long, low structure of stained wood set back from the lake's edge, with a wraparound deck, a large stone fireplace in the living room, and 4 bedrooms. The owner, reached by phone, told them the nearest town was 20 miles, the nearest neighbor was over a mile along the lake shore, and that the forecast called for clear skies for at least the first 3 days. He seemed pleasant and normal. The cabin seemed pleasant and normal. They unloaded the cars, stocked the kitchen, started a fire in the hearth, and by early evening had settled into the particular ease of old friends with nowhere to be and nothing to do. The first unsettling thing happened to Wren, on the first night, and she almost didn't mention it. She'd gone to bed early, she had a headache, she was tired from the drive. Her room was in the back of the cabin, facing away from the lake, facing the forest. She fell asleep without difficulty and slept well. But at some point in the night, she couldn't say what time, she hadn't looked at her phone, she woke to a sound in the room. Not outside the room. Not outside the cabin. In the room. It was a breathing sound. She lay completely still with her eyes closed, which she acknowledged was a strange first response, and listened. It was rhythmic and slow, deep, slow breathing, like someone asleep. Like someone in the room was asleep. She opened her eyes. The room was dark, the thick, complete dark of a room in the countryside with no ambient light, and she could see nothing. She reached for her phone on the nightstand and turned on the flashlight. The room was empty. Her room. Her bag in the corner. Her clothes on the chair. The door, which she had closed and which she could see was still closed. The closet door, also closed. Nothing else. She lay there with the flashlight on for a while. The sound had stopped the moment she moved to reach for the phone. She searched the room, closet, bathroom, under the bed, and found nothing. She went back to sleep eventually, phone face up on the nightstand. She didn't tell the others the next morning. She told herself it was a dream thing. The sort of auditory hallucination that happens in that half-space between sleeping and waking. Everyone has experienced something like that, she told herself. It wasn't worth worrying anyone else over. The next 2 days were unremarkable and pleasant. They hiked along the lake shore. They played cards in the evenings. They cooked elaborate dinners and drank wine and talked the way old friends do. In long, comfortable loops, circling back to old stories, bringing up things from 15 years ago and laughing about them in the way that only time can make possible. On the third night, Theron heard it. He'd gotten up around midnight to get a glass of water and had gone back to bed in the dark without turning on any lights, moving quietly to avoid waking Mina. He'd just gotten back into bed when he heard, very clearly, from the wall, from inside the wall, from within the structure of the cabin itself, a series of sounds that he immediately identified as footsteps. Not the settling wood sounds of a structure cooling overnight. Not the random creak of timber. Footsteps. Something moving in a slow, even pace inside the wall between their bedroom and the hallway. He lay there and counted 7 distinct footstep sounds, moving from one end of the wall to the other, and then silence. He got up. He woke Mina. They stood in the hallway and listened. Nothing. He checked the cabin, all rooms, the basement, a low, unfinished space accessible through a hatch in the floor of the laundry room, the exterior doors, which were all locked. He found nothing. They went back to bed. Mina, who had not heard the sounds from her deeper sleep, was reassuring but alert. She said it was probably a small animal. Squirrels sometimes got into wall cavities in old structures. It was reasonable. It was plausible. Theron did not believe it, but he accepted it, because it was the best available option. The 4th day was the day that changed everything. Casper had volunteered to cook a big dinner, a proper celebration of their last full evening there. He was the most capable cook of the 4 of them and had brought specific ingredients for a dish he wanted to try. He'd been in the kitchen most of the afternoon while the others sat on the deck. Late in the afternoon, he came out to join them, wiping his hands on a dish towel, and asked who had been in the kitchen earlier that morning, before anyone was up. None of them had been in the kitchen that morning before gathering for breakfast around 10. He took them inside and showed them what he'd found when he started cooking. The spice rack above the stove, a fixed wooden rack that had been there when they arrived, holding about 15 small jars, had been rearranged. Completely. Not randomly. The jars were in a specific order, sorted by label in a way that wasn't alphabetical and wasn't by color and wasn't by any organizational principle any of them could identify. They were in groupings. 3 jars in one cluster on the left, 2 in the center, 5 to the right, the others in the back. And each cluster had the jars turned so that the labels faced in the same direction, outward, toward the room. No one had rearranged them. They all said so, and they all believed each other. Wren, standing there looking at the spice rack, told them about the breathing she'd heard on the first night. Theron told them about the footsteps in the wall. For a while, nobody said anything. They considered leaving. This conversation happened. It was real. They discussed it seriously. But it was late afternoon. They had dinner half prepared. They had a full last night planned. And this is the part that is very human and very recognizable. None of them wanted to be the person who made everyone leave over a rearranged spice rack. So they stayed. Casper finished cooking. They ate dinner. They kept the lights on in every room. They kept each other in sight. At around midnight, Mina saw it. She had gone to use the bathroom and was walking back down the hallway to the bedroom when she saw, through the window at the end of the hallway, a window that looked out toward the forest behind the cabin, a light. Not a flashlight or a lamp. A faint, stationary glow, at roughly head height, just inside the tree line. It was there when she stopped and looked at it, and it was there when she called the others, and it was there when all 4 of them stood at that hallway window looking out at it. And then, not gradually, not with any fade, it was gone. They did not sleep that night. They sat together in the main room with every light in the cabin on and the fireplace burning, and they waited for morning, and in the morning they packed and left before the sun was fully up. The cabin rental platform listing is still active, as far as anyone who follows this story can determine. The reviews are mostly positive. A few mention strange sounds at night, attributed variously to wildlife, old wood, the wind off the lake. One review, left anonymously and since deleted, said only, "Don't look for the light in the trees. It already knows you're there." The 4th story is the shortest of the 5, but it might be the one that stays with you longest. A trail runner named Fua Mensicardi, experienced, fit, someone who ran ultras and spent more time in remote backcountry than most people spend in parks, was doing a solo training run in a forested region of central Vermont in early spring. Not staying in a cabin, initially. But the story becomes about a cabin, and we'll get there. She was running a route she'd partially planned and partially intended to improvise, in an area of public land that she'd run sections of before, but not this particular combination of trails. She had a map, a charged phone, enough food and water for a full day, and a headlamp in her pack even though she planned to be back well before dark. She was experienced enough to know that plans change. About 4 hours into the run, on a trail she didn't fully recognize from her planning, which wasn't alarming in itself, just a signal she'd taken a different fork than intended, she crested a small rise and found the cabin. It was not on any map she had. Not on the trail map, not on the topographic map she'd loaded on her phone. No record of it. But it was clearly real. A small, low structure of weathered gray wood, no larger than a single room, with a metal roof gone orange with rust and a single window facing the trail, the glass intact. No lock on the door that she could see. No sign. No indication of who it belonged to. She stopped. She was tired, her water was lower than she'd like, and a structure, even an unknown, unlisted, abandoned-seeming structure, represents shelter, and shelter is a meaningful thing when you're alone in the woods. She approached it. The door opened when she pushed it. Inside, a single room, as she'd suspected. A wooden floor, a rusted cast-iron stove, a table and 1 chair, and a shelf on the wall that held several items. The items on the shelf are what she came back to again and again when she told this story. There were a rusted tin cup, a folded piece of cloth so old it had no discernible original color, a small stack of papers, and a child's shoe. A single shoe, small, worn, its soul coming away from the upper. Just the one. She stood in the doorway and looked at these things without going inside. She doesn't know exactly why she didn't go inside. She didn't think it through in the moment, she said. She just didn't. Some awareness or instinct that she couldn't rationalize kept her on the threshold. She took a photograph through the doorway. Then she looked at the small stack of papers on the shelf. From the doorway, she could see that the papers had writing on them. Dense, small handwriting, covering each page completely. She could not read it from where she stood. She did not go in to read it more closely. And then she looked at the window. The single window facing the trail. There was a handprint on the glass. On the outside of the glass. She could tell by the orientation of the smear, by the direction the moisture had spread. On the outside of the window, a handprint. Small. The size of a child's hand. Pressed flat against the glass. She backed away from the cabin door. She turned around and ran. Not jogged, ran. Hard and fast, back the way she'd come, until the cabin was out of sight and she was on a trail she recognized and the world felt normal again. She ran the last 6 miles back to her car without stopping and drove to the nearest town and sat in a diner with a coffee until she stopped shaking. She has never been able to relocate the cabin on any map or satellite image. She has gone back to the area twice and has never found the trail that led to it. The photograph she took through the doorway exists. It shows exactly what she described. The items on the shelf. And in the window, clearly visible, the small handprint on the outside of the glass. The papers on the shelf. She still thinks about the papers. What was written on them. How long they had been there. Who had left them. And whether whoever wrote them had also once stood in that doorway and looked at that window and understood, as she had understood in an instant, that the handprint had not been made by whoever was inside. Ask yourself something now. If you had been in her position, if you had pushed open that door and seen that room and looked at that window, would you have gone inside? Think carefully. Because I suspect your first instinct is to say no. But I also suspect that if you were actually there, actually standing on that threshold with the weight of your pack on your shoulders and the quiet of the forest all around you, the curiosity would be pulling at you very hard. We want to know. Even when we shouldn't. Even when everything in us that is wise and old and connected to something that remembers what the dark can hold is saying, firmly and without ambiguity, do not cross that line. Sometimes the bravest thing is the turning around. And now we arrive at the 5th and final cabin. This is the one I want you to listen to most carefully. Not because it is the most dramatic, though it is dramatic. Not because it is the most frightening, though it is frightening. But because it is the one that refuses to be neatly contained. The other 4 stories have edges. This one does not. This one opens out into something that keeps going long after the telling ends. The 5th story is set in northern Canada, in the boreal forest of northern Ontario, in a region so remote that the nearest significant settlement is a fly-in community accessible primarily by small plane or, in winter, by ice road. This is a part of the world that most people in North America, even most Canadians, will never see. It is an enormous, ancient, overwhelmingly alive wilderness of black spruce and tamarack and muskeg, of lakes numbered and unnamed scattered across the landscape like mirror pieces dropped by something very large. The forest here is not like the forests of the Pacific Northwest or the Appalachians. It is lower, denser in a different way, a claustrophobic density of thin trunks packed close together, of ground covered in deep moss and bog vegetation, of a silence that is not peaceful but rather waiting. In this region, there are hunting and fishing camps, remote structures, some belonging to outfitters, some privately owned, accessible only by boat or float plane. Some of them are old enough that the original builders are long dead. Some of them have been used intermittently for generations and carry with them the accumulated presence of everyone who has ever slept within their walls. A small group of hunters, 3 of them, flew into one of these camps in late October. Their names, in the account that eventually circulated, are given as Reardon, Fest, and Ankh. The camp they were going to was owned by Riordan's family. His father had used it, his grandfather had used it, and he himself had been there many times. It sat on the southern shore of a lake with a Cree name that translates roughly, though the translation is debated, as something in the range of where the water keeps what is given to it. The camp consisted of the main cabin, a small storage shed, an outhouse, and a dock that had been repaired and rebuilt so many times that almost none of the original material remained. They flew in on a float plane that left them with their gear and their provisions and their confidence in their own experience, and they settled in quickly. Reardon knew the place. He knew where everything was, how everything worked, what the lake sounded like in the morning, what the forest sounded like at night. He'd been coming since childhood. The familiarity was a source of deep comfort. The first 3 days were unremarkable and good, cold, clear, productive in terms of what they'd come for, deeply satisfying in the way that remote wilderness can be when everything is working properly. They cooked over the stove in the evenings, talked late, slept well in the cold. The stars over the lake were extraordinary. Reardon said more than once that this was the trip he'd needed, that this was the place. On the 4th day, Fest found the other cabin. It was about 40 minutes on foot from the main camp, deeper into the forest to the north, accessible by following a game trail that Reardon had walked many times, but which this day seemed to take them somewhere different. Fest had pushed further up the trail than Reardon had gone before. He'd gone ahead while Reardon and Ankh stopped at the shore of a small pond, and when Reardon and Ankh caught up with him, he was standing looking at a structure in the trees. It was a cabin. Small, old, significantly older than their own camp, built from logs in the old way, the chinking between the logs mostly gone. No windows. One door, made from rough-hewn planks, hanging slightly open. Reardon was certain this cabin had not been there on any of his previous visits. He acknowledged that he had never come this far along this particular trail, but he knew the geography of the land around the camp well enough, he thought, to account for a structure. He did not know this cabin. He had never heard it mentioned. His father had never mentioned it. It appeared on no map of the region that he was aware of. They approached it. The interior was small, perhaps 10 feet by 12, with a dirt floor. There was a rusted stove in one corner that was not the same type as the stove in their camp, older and different in design. There were no furnishings. The walls and ceiling were intact. The log walls on the interior had markings on them, carved into the wood, deep and deliberate, covering nearly every available surface. The markings were not language, or not any language the three of them recognized. They were patterns. Geometric somewhat, but organic too, curves and angles that seemed to interact with each other in ways that the eye kept following without ever reaching a resolution. The floor of the cabin, the dirt floor, had been disturbed at some point. Not recently, but in the relatively recent past, perhaps within the last year or two. The dirt in the center of the floor was higher than the dirt around the edges, forming a low mound roughly the dimensions of, and no one who tells this story can avoid the comparison, a grave. They stood in the doorway of this cabin for a very short time. Nobody suggested going inside. They pulled the door closed as best they could and walked back down the trail to the camp in silence, and they did not talk about what they'd seen until that evening. Around the fire, they talked about it in careful, measured tones. All three of them acknowledged what the mound looked like. All three of them acknowledged that the carved markings on the walls were unusual and unfamiliar. Reardon said he would contact the Ontario Ministry of Natural Resources when they got back, report the structure, see if anyone had a record of it. He made a note on his phone. He took photos before they left the cabin, interior shots of the wall carvings, the stove, the floor. 6 photographs. That night, the sounds began. They began around midnight. All three men were awake and could agree on this afterward. The sounds came from the direction of the forest to the north, the direction of the old cabin. They were not animal sounds. This is the thing that all three of them came back to again and again when they talked about this later. They had experience in the field. They knew what animals sounded like in remote wilderness at night, had heard wolves, bears, moose, the whole register of large and small fauna in that environment. These sounds did not fit any of those categories. They were, by the best description any of the three could give, like something very large moving with complete deliberateness through the forest, slow, measured, impossibly slow, in a direction that was getting closer to the camp. And beneath the sound of movement, something else. A lower sound. A register at the edge of what the ear can resolve into language. Not words. Not quite. But shaped the way words are shaped. Structured. Intentional. The movement sound stopped at the edge of the camp. They could track it, at the end, to within perhaps 50 feet of the cabin wall. And then it stopped. And the low, structured sound continued alone, without the movement, for perhaps 3 or 4 minutes. And then that stopped too. Reardon had his rifle. He did not go outside. Nobody went outside. They sat in the main cabin with the lantern burning and the door latched, and they did not sleep and they did not speak much. And in the morning they called the float plane company on the satellite phone and asked for an early pickup, saying they'd gotten what they came for. The plane came the following morning. The pilot, a man who'd been flying hunters and fishermen into that part of the country for over 20 years, asked them how the trip was. Reardon said it was good. He asked, almost as an afterthought, if the pilot knew anything about an old log cabin to the north of the camp, in the forest past the long game trail. The pilot went quiet for a moment. Then he said, "North of the Kearns camp?" Reardon said yes. That was the name, Kearns Camp, his family name. The pilot was quiet again. Then he said he'd heard stories about a structure up there. Not from any official source. From the Cree community. From elders who had talked about that area of forest in ways that suggested it was not a place to spend time. He couldn't say more than that because that's all he knew. But he said, and this is the part that Reardon repeated every time he told the story afterward, he said, "Some places up here have been left alone for reasons. The people who've been here longest know which ones. It's better to ask before you go somewhere than after." Reardon looked up the old cabin after they returned. He contacted the Ministry of Natural Resources. He dug into historical records of the region, into archives of the Hudson's Bay Company that had operated trading posts in that area in the 18th and 19th centuries, into any source he could find that might give him context for a log structure of that apparent age in that location. What he found was not a clear answer, but a direction. There were references, in HBC records from the mid-1800s, to a structure in that lake region associated with a specific individual, a trapper and sometime trader of uncertain origin who had operated alone in that area for an unknown period, and who appears in the records only in marginal, passing references, in the accounts of Cree guides who occasionally encountered him. These references are sparse, fragmentary, and not entirely consistent. But they share certain elements. The structure is mentioned. The carvings on its walls are mentioned. And in 2 separate accounts, written by different HBC men decades apart, there is a note about a specific area of ground within the structure, described in one account as disturbed earth in the manner of a deliberate interment, and in the other as simply, the floor is wrong in the center. What is buried there, or what was buried there, or whether the mound Reardon and his companions saw has any connection to these 19th century accounts, is unknown. The photographs Reardon took inside the old cabin, the 6 photographs of the wall carvings and interior, he has shown to several people. He has not shared them online. He has described them to people, and people have passed on those descriptions. The carvings, as described, have been looked at by at least 2 individuals with backgrounds in indigenous studies and pre-contact material culture of the northern boreal region, both of whom have said, with appropriate caution, that the patterns don't clearly match any specific tradition they're familiar with, but that certain elements suggest very old practice, possibly pre-contact, possibly associated with traditions of marking a place as dangerous or prohibited, a warning, in other words. A sign that was meant to be read, meant to keep people away. Which raises a question that Reardon has not been able to stop asking himself. If the markings were a warning, what were they warning about? About what is in that place? About what is buried under that floor? Or about what might come to that place if the right or wrong kind of attention is paid to it? Because here is the thing about warnings. Warnings are made for people who haven't arrived yet. They are made in anticipation. They are made because someone at some point understood that people would come, that curious, wandering, unlucky, or simply uninformed people would eventually push up that trail and find that structure and open that door. And understood that when that happened, something would follow. Reardon has not been back to the camp since that trip. He sold the family's rights to the camp to an outfitter who runs parties through the region. He did not tell the outfitter about the old cabin to the north. He says he debates this decision often. He says he's not sure it would matter. He says he's not sure the cabin could be found again unless it wanted to be. He still has the photographs. He looks at them sometimes. He says the carvings bother him in a way he can't fully explain. Not their content, which he can't interpret, but their density. The completeness of them. Wall to wall, floor to ceiling, inside a structure that no one was supposed to find. Whoever made those markings was not making them for a visitor. They were making them for themselves. For something they were living with, something they were trying to contain or communicate with or appease, alone in the boreal forest in the 19th century or possibly long before, with no one within 100 miles and the lake outside keeping whatever had been given to it. He thinks about that person sometimes. The solitary figure who built that cabin in those trees, who covered every inch of the interior with marks that haven't been clearly interpreted a century and a half later, who dug a hole in the center of the floor for reasons we can only speculate about, who was so far from any help, any community, any familiar world, and who, presumably at some point, stopped. 5 cabins. 5 groups of people who went into the woods looking for something and found something else. And what connects them? Not location, they are spread across a continent. Not time, they span different decades. Not demographics, the people involved are different in almost every respect. What connects them is simpler and more unsettling than any of that. What connects them is the moment. The moment of recognition. The moment when the rational mind, which is very good at generating comfortable explanations and very reluctant to abandon them, runs out of comfortable explanations. The moment when you're standing in the clearing with your heart going too fast and, not think, not suspect, not wonder, you know that something is out there and it is aware of you. That moment is what these stories are really about. Not the shapes in the tree line, not the marks on the doors, not the sounds in the walls. Those things are just the mechanism. The experience that all 5 of these accounts share is the experience of that moment. The collapse of the ordinary, the sudden and non-negotiable arrival of something that does not fit in the world as you've understood it. And the reason that experience is so powerful, so lasting, so difficult to talk away in daylight, is that it confirms something very old and very deep that we try very hard not to think about. That the world is much larger than our understanding of it. That the natural world, particularly the parts of it that still exist outside our management and our signage and our built structures, is not indifferent to us in the gentle cosmic sense. That there are things in it that are aware. That there are places in it that are not safe. That the door of the cabin, wherever it sits, whatever the latch is made of, marks a line that matters far more than we like to think. Ask yourself this, finally, as we close tonight. Think about the places you've been that made you feel watched. Not because you were, not necessarily, but because the sensation was there, clear and specific and unignorable. Most people have had this experience at least once. Most people have filed it away and moved on. But think about it now. Think about where you were. What the light was like. What the air smelled like. What the sound was like, or wasn't. And think about whether you've ever fully explained it to yourself. If you have, If you were able to find the explanation that fit perfectly, that settled the feeling completely and permanently, then you were luckier than most. And if you haven't, if there's still a corner of that memory that doesn't quite resolve into something comfortable, that sits just past the edge of the light in the room you're sitting in right now, then you already know. You don't need the explanation. You know what that feeling is. It's the knowledge that something knows where you are, and that the woods, wherever they are, whatever country they stand in, whatever century we think we live in, the woods have never been empty. Not for a single night in all of human history have the woods been empty. And somewhere, right now, someone is sitting in a cabin. The fire is low. The walls are creaking in the way that walls creak when they are settling, or when something is in them, and they haven't yet decided which explanation they want to believe. The night outside is deep and full and very, very old. And at the edge of the trees, in the dark that the porch light doesn't reach, something that has been there for longer than the cabin, longer than the road, longer than the name of any person who has ever walked this land, something is standing still. Watching. Waiting, without urgency, the way things wait when they understand that time is not a factor. When they know, with the patient certainty of everything that existed before us and will exist after, that eventually the person inside will look up, will look toward the window, will look out into the dark, and will feel, for just a second, before they look away and tell themselves it was nothing, that something is looking back. Don't go anywhere. We're just getting started.